Her mother used to kneel in the cold marshes north of town, sinking into sphagnum until the dark water soaked through both their stockings and pressed the girl's fingers into the moss beside the red berries that grew where nothing else would. She would lift a thin green runner from the peat and hold it up, and the girl could smell wintergreen and mud and crushed fruit on her mother's hands, and the lesson was always the same: sour ground is not dead ground. Her mother had been dead 4 years the morning a man dropped a deed to 46 acres of frozen bog at her daughter's feet and told her it was land. The deed was for 46 acres 3 miles off the wagon road north of Berlin, Wisconsin. March of 1871. Ada Whitlock stood in mud that had not thawed all the way through, holding a piece of paper her father had dropped at her feet like spoiled grain, and she understood exactly what he had given her. Not land, a sentence. She was 18 years old. Her mother had been dead 4 years. Her stepmother, Celia, had carried the deed between two fingertips, as if the paper itself might stain her, and when Ada's father, Ephraim, said the words, "You wanted land, there's land," nobody in the wheat barn moved except the hired men, who suddenly found something to do with their hands. The half-brothers, 7 and 9, pressed against Celia's skirts. Wheat dust hung in a stripe of cold light from the door. A frozen harness hook clinked once against the wall, and that small metallic sound was the last thing Ada heard in her father's house. She had $6.80, a patch quilt her mother had sewn from worn flour sacking, one iron pot with a crack along the rim that she sealed with pine pitch every third use, her mother's berry knife, narrow-bladed and sharp enough to split a hair, a cracked lantern, 2 bushel sacks, and a deed no bank clerk in Waushara County would look at twice, the land everyone in Berlin called the Sour Sink. She walked the 3 miles that first afternoon, carrying everything she owned in the 2 sacks, balanced across her shoulders with a pole she cut from a roadside willow. The track from the wagon road dissolved into sedge and standing water within a quarter-mile. She lost a boot in black muck up to her shin and spent 10 minutes pulling it free while the cold seeped through her stocking and turned her toes white. By the time she found the boundary post, a rotting oak stake with a rusted nail where someone had once hung a survey tag, the light was failing and her teeth had not stopped chattering for an hour. The shanty sat at the bog's eastern edge, a cranberry picker's shelter, maybe 10 feet by 8, with half its roof boards curled back like dead bark. The door hung on a single leather hinge. Inside, a plank sleeping shelf, a stone-lined pit that had once held coals, mouse droppings in every corner, and water seeping under the sill in a slow, dark tongue that reached halfway across the floor. Ada set the iron pot on the stone pit, stuffed the cracks in the walls with sedge she tore from the dooryard, and spread the quilt on the plank shelf. The quilt froze to the wall by midnight. She heard muskrats gnawing under the floorboards. She heard the bog breathing, a low, wet sound like something large exhaling through a cloth. She did not sleep. In the morning, she stood outside and looked at what her father had given her, and she understood the joke. 46 acres of acid peat, tamarack brush, wiregrass, sedge tussocks, and standing water the color of black tea. Here and there, a hummock rose a foot or two above the waterline, crowned with sphagnum moss so saturated it squelched when she stepped on it. The creek, barely wide enough for 2 people to stand in, cut through the southern quarter, sluggish and dark, choked with fallen brush and beaver-gnawed stumps. No cleared ground, no fence, no road, no neighbor within a mile who would claim the word. She had no husband, no legal guardian who would co-sign a note, no team, no plow, no seed, no lumber that was not already rotting. Her father expected, Celia expected, that she would return the deed within a month, humiliated, and accept whatever arrangement Ephraim offered. A room in the hired man's quarters. A life answering to Celia. Ada pulled the berry knife from her belt and cut a notch into the boundary stake. One mark. One day on her own land. 3 days after Ada moved onto the bog, Orrin Pike came to see what she was doing. Everybody asked Orrin before buying land. 59 years old, lean as a fence rail, with a white beard trimmed short and hands permanently swollen at the knuckles from 30 years of post-hole work. Town board member, wheat grower, former canal laborer who had moved west for cheap dirt and found it. He had opinions about soil the way a preacher has opinions about sin, loudly, frequently, and without invitation. He arrived on a gray mule, looked at the shanty, looked at Ada standing in front of it with peat mud caked to her elbows, and dismounted without greeting her. "Show me," he said. They walked the bog together. Orrin did not hurry. He kicked tussocks. He knelt once and smelled the water, then wiped his fingers on his trousers, as if the acid might eat through. He pulled a handful of peat apart and held it up to the light, watching the dark fibers drip. He tested the creek bank with his boot heel and watched the mud close over the print like a mouth. At the end of the walk, he stood with his arms crossed and delivered the verdict Ada already knew was coming, but needed to hear spoken aloud so she could understand exactly how deep the hole was. "You have water where you need ground," Orrin said. "You have acid where you need sweet soil. You have no team, no seed, no fence, and no man to sign a note." He paused, not for cruelty, but because he believed in being thorough. "Corn will yellow here. Potatoes will rot. Wheat will not even forgive you long enough to die slowly." Ada said nothing. Orrin looked at the shanty. "How long can you eat on what you carried in?" "A week, maybe 10 days if I stretch the flour." "And after that?" She did not answer because the answer was nothing, and saying nothing was better than saying that. Orrin remounted the mule. "Sell it back to your father, or sell it to Ellery Vale. He has been asking about creek-front parcels." He looked down at her. "There is no shame in a bad hand, girl. The shame is starving on pride." He rode away through the tamarack, and Ada watched until the mule's haunches disappeared into the brush. Then she went back to the shanty and counted her money again. $6.80. She needed flour by the end of the week. She needed lamp oil. She needed nails, wool, pork, if she could find it cheap. She needed $100 before winter to cover food, supplies, and the tax payment on 46 acres of land that produced nothing. A hired girl in Berlin might earn 75 cents a week with board. Ada had no board. Working in town meant leaving the bog, and leaving the bog meant losing it, to taxes, to Ellery Vale, to her father's patient expectation that hunger would bring her home. She could not leave. She had nowhere to go that was not back, and going back was not survival. Going back was Celia's house and Celia's rules, and a life where she owned nothing, decided nothing, and existed on the tolerance of a woman who had wanted her gone since the wedding. The bog was impossible. Leaving was worse. That night she lay on the frozen plank shelf and listened to water seeping under the sill, and she hated the land with a fury that kept her warm for almost an hour. Then the cold won, and she curled into the quilt and pressed her face against the wool and breathed until she could feel her fingers again. In the morning she found something. Not hope. Something smaller and more dangerous than hope. She found a question. She was on her knees at the creek edge, breaking ice from a shallow pool to wash her face, when she saw them. Low green runners threaded through the sphagnum, half hidden under brown sedge litter, with tiny upright shoots no taller than her thumb. She had seen these before. She had seen them 100 times as a child, kneeling in cold marshes while her mother, Her real mother, not Celia, picked berries with Ho-Chunk women who knew every wet meadow between Berlin and Hancock. Cranberry vines. They were everywhere. Not planted, not cultivated, just growing, the way they had grown for 1,000 years in acid peat and cold water and sand, in exactly the kind of land that Orrin Pike had pronounced dead. Ada sat back on her heels in the freezing muck and looked at the bog with different eyes. Not wheat eyes, not corn eyes, not the eyes of a town that measured land by what it could be forced to grow. She looked at the bog the way her mother had taught her to look, for what was already there. The question formed slowly, like ice crystallizing on still water. What if the land was not worthless? What if everyone had simply been asking it the wrong thing? She tried the conventional way first, because she was not a fool, and she knew that a hunch about wild berries would not fill her stomach next week. She found a hummock on the bog's north edge, where the peat was thinnest, and the ground almost resembled soil. She spaded it open with the only tool she had, a flat piece of iron she pried from the shanty's ruined stove. She planted 6 potato eyes saved from her mother's cellar, watered them from the creek, and waited. Within 4 days the patch turned sour-smelling and black. Water seeped up through the spaded ground faster than it drained. The potato leaves barely emerged curled and yellowed, and then went the color of a bruise. By the 6th day the patch was a small swamp of rotting vegetable matter that smelled like vinegar and defeat. Orrin had been right about potatoes. He had been right about corn. He had been right about wheat. The acid and the water would kill any crop that needed sweet, drained ground. But he had not been right about the land. He had been right about the wrong question. Ada went back to the shanty and dug through her sacks until she found what she was looking for. A small notebook, water-stained and dog-eared, tucked inside a flour tin that had been her mother's. Not a book of science, not a manual. A book of women's knowledge, written in her mother's careful hand. Where berries grew thickest, when to pick, which moss meant the water was too acid even for cranberries, which vines fruited and which only ran, where frost settled earliest, which marshes the Ho-Chunk harvesters visited before the settlers fenced the land and the picking agreements fell apart. Ada read it sitting on the sleeping shelf, with the cracked lantern balanced on her knee. She read it twice. Then she put on her boots and walked the bog with the notebook open. She knelt in cold water and separated cranberry runners from wiregrass with her fingers. She found upright shoots, the fruiting stems, the ones that carried berries. She found patches where windblown sand had drifted over the vines, and in those patches the growth was stronger, the runners thicker, the uprights more numerous. Her mother's notebook confirmed what she was seeing. Sand encouraged rooting. Acid water was not poison to these plants. It was home. The idea took shape not as a flash of insight, but as a slow accumulation of observations that pointed the same direction. Do not drain the bog. Do not sweeten the soil. Do not force the land into something it refuses to be. Instead, make the bog more deliberately, more productively itself. Clear the brush without tearing up the established vines. Dig shallow ditches to control the water level, not to eliminate water, but to raise and lower it on purpose. Build a plank sluice at the bend in the creek where the flow could be caught and directed. Spread thin layers of sand over the vine beds to encourage rooting and new growth, the way the wind already did it naturally. Harvest by hand in fall using fingers and crude wooden scoops, not some future machine, just patient labor. Pack the berries in barrels for cold storage. Sell some for cash. Keep the rest as winter food, tart, sour, packed with whatever it was that kept sailors from getting sick on long voyages. And then, after harvest, flood the vine beds deliberately. Let water cover the plants. Let ice form over the flood. The frozen blanket would protect the vines, and next year's buds from the killing wind. The freeze and thaw heaving that ripped roots from the ground, and the deep cold that turned exposed plant tissue to brown mush. It was not a new invention. It was an old practice made deliberate, and it depended on the one thing the bog had more of than anyone could want: water. Ada closed the notebook and looked at 46 acres of acid peat and standing water and tangled vines, and for the first time she did not see a wasteland. She saw a system, broken, neglected, overgrown, but alive, and waiting for someone who understood what it was instead of cursing it for what it was not. The problem was that understanding and doing were separated by a canyon of labor, knowledge, and time she might not have. Tamsin Rusk found Ada counting berries on a Tuesday. Tamsin was 22, sharp-faced, work-thin, the widowed daughter of a farmer whose land bordered the eastern edge of Ada's bog. She had done laundry and harvest labor alongside Ada when they were both younger, before Ada's mother died and the family fractured. Tamsin was not unkind. She was practical in the way that poor women on the frontier had to be practical. She measured kindness against survival and rarely found the math favorable. She stood at the edge of the cleared patch where Ada had been pulling sedge for 3 days and watched Ada weigh a quart of berries on a hanging scale improvised from a stick and a stone. "What are you doing?" Tamsin asked. "Counting," Ada said. She scratched numbers into a cedar shingle with a nail. Quarts per picking, quarts per bushel, bushels per barrel. A barrel was 100 pounds. She needed to know how many barrels the bog could produce, because barrels were money, and money was the distance between her and the poorhouse. Tamsin watched the scratching. "Even if the berries grow," she said, "you cannot eat tart fruit all winter. You cannot hitch vines to a plow. You cannot pay taxes with a handful of red beads." Ada did not look up. "A barrel of cranberries sells for $3 in Milwaukee. 4 in Chicago, if the buyer is honest. I need 20 barrels to clear the tax and buy winter supplies. The bog has native vines across 18 acres. If I can clear and manage even half of that—" "Half of 18 acres," Tamsin said, "cleared by one woman, with no tools, before frost." "Before frost," Ada agreed. Tamsin shook her head, but she did not leave immediately, and Ada noticed that. She noticed that Tamsin looked at the berries on the scale with something that was not quite pity and not quite interest, but lived somewhere between the two. A look that said the numbers were not completely insane, even if the woman doing the counting probably was. After Tamsin left, Ada went back to the shingle and finished her calculations. 20 barrels. 2,000 pounds of sorted, sound cranberries. From wild vines she had not yet cleared. On land she could barely walk across without sinking to her knees, using tools she did not own, in a season that was already burning like a fuse toward the first hard frost. She needed someone who knew how to turn wild vines into a crop. She needed it before the season outran her completely. She did not have that person. She had a berry knife, a dead woman's notebook, and the particular stubbornness of someone who has been told the land beneath her feet is worthless and has decided to argue. The word traveled faster than Ada expected. Within a week of her refusal to sell, the story had reached every counter and church pew in Berlin. Ada Whitlock, the girl Ephraim put out, was living on the sour sink. Not just living, working, digging ditches, pulling brush, crawling through the mud on her hands and knees, doing something with vines that nobody could quite describe because nobody had bothered to walk close enough to see. She became the bog girl. It was not said with admiration. At the general store, men gathered by the nail kegs and joked that she was farming frogs. A man named Torkel, hired hand, big shoulders, small imagination, said he would bet $1 she would be back at her father's table by June. Another man took the bet and said, "May." They laughed about it with the comfortable cruelty of people who have never been that poor and cannot imagine it happening to them. Women were different. Women did not laugh because women understood how close they all stood to Ada's edge. But they did not help either, not openly. Poverty was treated like weather, acknowledged, endured, never approached too closely in case it was catching. One woman left a sack of old bread on the trail where Ada would find it. Another offered prayers at the Wednesday meeting. Neither offered labor or tools or credit. The storekeeper, a man named Fenton, refused Ada full credit for nails. She needed nails to repair the shanty roof. She had $2.11 after buying flour. The nails cost 60 cents. Fenton looked at her across the counter and said he could not extend credit without a cosigner. "I own 46 acres, Ada said. "You own 46 acres of swamp," Fenton said. He was not trying to be cruel. He was trying to be accurate, which in that moment was worse. She bought the nails with cash she could not afford to spend. She carried them home in her coat pocket and felt their weight against her hip the whole 3 miles, each one a small iron accusation. You cannot afford this, and you bought it anyway, and winter does not forgive bad arithmetic. Then Ellery Vale made his offer. Ellery was 43, barrel broker, commission buyer, small land speculator. He dressed better than Berlin required and spoke with the careful friendliness of a man who has learned that courtesy costs nothing and returns a great deal. He owned no marshland himself, but he had spent 2 years mapping every creek and water channel in the township, and he understood something that Ada's neighbors did not. Water was going to be worth more than wheat. If Ellery could own the bog, he could control the floodwater that fed neighboring low meadows. He could charge growers for access. He could drain selectively and sell the peat. The berries meant nothing to him. The water meant everything. He arrived at the shanty on a Saturday, dismounted a good horse, and walked through the bog without once looking at the ground. He looked at the creek. He looked at the water levels. He looked at where the flow could be dammed, diverted, held. Then he turned to Ada and smiled the way a man smiles when he's about to do you a favor that costs you everything. $12, he said. Cash today. Ada said nothing. Cash today is kinder than hunger in December, Ellery said. He held out the money, paper bills, folded once. Your father gave you a problem. I'm offering you a solution. No, Ada said. Ellery's smile did not change. That was the part that frightened her. The refusal did not surprise him or anger him or inconvenience him. It simply shifted his approach from purchase to pressure, and the shift was so smooth that Ada understood she was dealing with someone who had planned for the word no. Within a week, Ellery's pressure began to work. He told Fenton, the storekeeper, not to extend credit to Ada for anything larger than flour and salt. Told him quietly, as a friend, as advice about a bad risk. He told Orrin Pike that a girl digging ditches and diverting creek water without supervision would flood the neighboring hay ground and ruin the drainage for every farmer downstream. He told Tamsin Rusk directly that Ada would drag anyone who helped her into debt. The effects arrived one by one, like stones dropped into a well. Boys left a dead frog on the shanty step with a note that said, Sour Queen. Someone painted the same words on a barrel head and leaned it against the boundary stake. A hired man who had been willing to sell Ada a used spade told her the price was double what he had quoted the week before, and when she asked why, he would not meet her eyes. Church women brought old bread, but not labor. Neighbors nodded, but did not stop. Ada worked in view of the wagon road, and people slowed their horses to watch, and then they moved on, and the watching was worse than the mockery because it meant she had become entertainment. She was not merely poor. She was a story people told to prove that some ideas are foolish and some land is cursed, and some girls do not know their place. And each night she came back to the shanty with her hands bleeding from sedge cuts and her boots heavy with black water. And she set the lantern on the shelf and opened her mother's notebook and read the entries about which vines fruited strongest in acid sand. And she told herself the numbers were not insane. 20 barrels, 2,000 pounds, $3 a barrel in Milwaukee, $60, enough for tax, flour, pork, oil, and nails, enough to survive one winter, enough to prove the bog was not a joke. She just had to get there first. April bled into May, and Ada worked. She cleared brush with the berry knife and a hand axe she bought for $1.15 from a man who felt guilty enough about overcharging to throw in a whetstone. She cut tamarack poles for the edges of her first ditch, a shallow trench running from the creek bend toward the vine beds on what she had begun calling Mother's Bed, the patch where the native vines grew thickest. She dug with the iron scrap from the stove and with her hands. She moved mud one bucket at a time, using a sap bucket she found half buried behind the shanty, its bottom seam split and repaired with pine pitch and prayer. The first ditch took 9 days, 40 feet long, 18 inches deep, barely wide enough for her arm. It connected the creek to a low spot where water pooled uselessly. When she opened the upstream end, the water moved, slowly, reluctantly, as if the bog resented being organized. But it moved, and it lowered the standing water on Mother's Bed by 3 inches. 3 inches. 9 days of labor for 3 inches of drainage. She needed 6 more ditches. She needed the sluice built. She needed sand spread. She needed brush cleared from 2 more beds. Creek bed along the southern channel and north bed on the exposed high ground where frost would settle first. And she needed someone who knew what she was doing, because the notebook told her what to look for, but not how to build what she was imagining. She needed hands that had touched a working cranberry marsh, not just a wild one. She needed knowledge she could not get from a dead woman's handwriting. The sedge cut her palms open twice in the first week. She wrapped the cuts with strips torn from her spare chemise and kept digging. The wrappings turned brown with bog water and stiff with dried blood, and she changed them when the smell became a problem. Her shoulders ached with a deep bone-seated pain that made lifting the axe above her waist a negotiation between will and muscle. She ate flour paste and boiled sedge roots, and once, a muskrat she caught in a deadfall near the creek. The muskrat tasted like mud and desperation, and she ate every scrap, including the liver. She lost weight she did not have to lose. Her dresses hung, her cheekbones sharpened. She could see the tendons in her forearms when she gripped the axe handle, and she thought, this is what it looks like when a body's being used as a tool. But the ditches grew. One, then the beginning of a second. The vine beds on Mother's Bed began to show their shape as the brush came away. A dense mat of runners and uprights, the green darkening as the days lengthened, tiny white buds forming in the leaf axils like promises written in a language only the bog understood. If those buds survived, if frost did not take them, if she could build the sluice before fall, if she could harvest enough to fill 20 barrels, if anyone would buy them, if. The word followed her through the ditches like a second shadow. And then Ellery Vale visited the county clerk and asked about unpaid taxes on the parcel known as the Sour Sink, and Ada learned that the clock she was racing was not just the season. Ellery knew the tax was due in October. He knew she could not pay it. And he knew that unpaid tax on worthless land was the cheapest way to take it. Cheaper than $12, cheaper than a smile and a folded bill. All he had to do was wait. Ada heard about the visit from Tamsin, who heard it from the clerk's wife, who had mentioned it at the church quilting as a piece of gossip and not a warning, but Ada received it as a warning. She stood in the half-dug second ditch with mud to her knees and water leaking through the upstream wall, and her hands raw and her back a column of fire. And she understood that the bog was not her only enemy, and the season was not her only clock. She had until October. She had $6 that were now $4.65. She had one ditch finished and one started and four more needed. She had no sluice. She had no sand spread. She had no barrels, no hoops, no way to ship, and no buyer. And she had Ellery Vale circling like a man who has already written the receipt. The wind shifted. The tamarack needles caught the last light and turned gold against the darkening sky. Somewhere in the bog, a bittern boomed its strange hollow call, and Ada stood in the ditch and listened, and the sound was so lonely and so much like her own situation that she almost laughed. Almost. Not quite. Laughter required energy she had already spent. She picked up the bucket and went back to digging. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who only understood one way to measure what was possible? The woman who changed everything arrived because Ada was doing something wrong. It was late May. Ada had finished the second ditch and started the third, working from the creek bend toward North Bed where the ground was higher and the peat thinner and the frost would settle first come fall. She was on her knees chopping at a tangle of wiregrass and sedge roots with her mother's berry knife, trying to expose the vine runners underneath without tearing them apart, and she was failing. The knife was too short. Her angle was wrong. Every time she freed a runner, she pulled up two uprights with it, their white roots dangling like stripped thread. She did not hear the woman until a voice behind her said, "You are killing them." Ada turned. A woman stood at the ditch edge, 61 years old, lean and straight-backed, with a face like a walnut. Brown, deeply lined, hard in a way that suggested the hardness had been earned over decades rather than chosen. She wore a faded calico dress, a man's wool coat cut down at the sleeves, and boots that had been resoled so many times the leather and the patches had become the same thing. Her hands were large for a woman's body and scarred across the knuckles. "You are cutting the uprights," the woman said. "The uprights carry the fruit. The runners carry the plant. You need both. But if you must choose, save the uprights." Ada sat back on her heels. "Who are you?" "Mercy Toby." She did not offer a hand or a smile. She looked past Ada at the vine bed with an expression that was not pity or interest, but something closer to professional assessment. The look of a person seeing familiar work done badly. "Cape Cod born. My husband was a cooper. I sorted and picked in the Harwich yards for 11 seasons before he died, and I came west with my sister's family." She dropped to one knee beside Ada without being invited, and the motion was practiced. One knee down, the other braced, weight balanced so she could stay low for hours without her back seizing. She reached into the tangle and lifted a single cranberry runner between her thumb and forefinger, gently, the way a person lifts a thread they do not want to break. "This is a runner," she said. "It grows along the ground. It roots at the nodes. It sends up uprights." She traced the runner to a point where a thin vertical stem rose from it, no thicker than a straw. "This is an upright. It grows 1 to 3 inches tall. The buds form at the tip in late summer. Those buds overwinter and produce flowers the next spring. The flowers become berries. If you cut the upright, you cut next year's crop." She let go of the runner and looked at Ada. "How many have you pulled out today?" Ada looked at the pile of debris beside the ditch. She could see the pale stubs of broken uprights mixed with the sedge and wiregrass. Dozens. Maybe more. "I did not know," Ada said. "Now you do." Mercy stood. "Show me the rest." They walked the bog together. The second walk of assessment Ada had endured. But this one was different. Where Orrin Pike had looked at the land and seen failure, Mercy Toby looked at the land and saw neglect. She knelt at each vine bed, parted the covering vegetation, and examined the growth underneath with the focused attention of someone reading a letter in bad handwriting. At Mother's bed, she nodded. Good native stock, dense runners. You have uprights here that are 3 years old, maybe 4. The bed wants clearing, not planting. At creek bed, she frowned. Strong vines, but the grass is choking them. You need to clear this without flooding it first, or the roots will rot before you can manage the water. At north bed, she crouched for a long time and said nothing. Then, this bed is exposed, north-facing slope, no windbreak, frost pocket. The uprights here will bud late and freeze early, unless you can cover them before the worst cold. She looked at Ada. Can you flood this bed separately? I do not know yet. I have not built the sluice. Then learn quickly. This bed will tell you whether you are a grower or a girl with good intentions. The words were not gentle. Mercy did not deal in gentleness, but there was something underneath the bluntness that Ada recognized, the respect of one working person for another who was attempting something real, however badly. Mercy had seen Ada's ditches. She had seen the cleared brush. She had seen the raw hands and the weight loss and the repaired shanty roof. She had seen someone working, not pretending. That night Mercy stayed. She did not ask. She laid her blanket on the floor of the shanty beside the sleeping shelf, complained about the damp, plugged 2 gaps in the wall with moss she pulled from the dooryard, and told Ada to boil water for tea she had brought in her coat pocket. Real tea, not sedge root, the first Ada had tasted in weeks. Over the tea, Mercy explained what Ada needed to learn. Not everything. Not a lecture. A list delivered the way a foreman delivers a work order, clear, numbered, and non-negotiable. First, vine handling, how to lift, thin, and clear around established mats without tearing the root network apart. How to identify runners versus uprights versus the sedge and wiregrass that mimicked them. How to tell a live vine from a dead one by the color of the inner stem. Green meant alive. Brown meant last year's growth. Black meant rot. Second, sand. How to spread it thin and even, never more than ½ an inch, never burying the vine tips. Sand encouraged rooting at the nodes. It warmed faster than peat in spring. It suppressed the fungal growth that turned berries soft, but too thick, and it smothered the uprights. The patch on Mother's bed where Ada had noticed stronger growth. Wind-blown sand, a 1/4 inch deep. Nature doing what Mercy was about to teach Ada to do on purpose. Third, water control. This was the most important and the most dangerous. The sluice was not just a convenience. It was the difference between a marsh that produced and a marsh that drowned. Flood too deep and the vines suffocated. Flood too shallow and the wind stripped the buds. Drain too fast and the roots dried. Drain too slow and the stagnant water bred rot. The water is not your tool, Mercy said. It is your partner. You do not tell it what to do. You learn when it is ready to move and you open the way. Fourth, sorting and storage. Not every berry was worth keeping. Soft fruit rotted in the barrel and spoiled everything it touched. Sound fruit, firm, dark red, with that particular bounce when dropped on a hard surface, could last months in a cool space. Sort hard. Reject more than you keep. A barrel of good cranberries was worth $3. A barrel of mixed fruit with soft rot spreading through it was worth nothing and would poison the buyer's trust permanently. Mercy did not teach all of this in one night. She taught it over weeks, in the field, on her knees, with her hands in the cold water and the peat mud and the vine mats, showing Ada by doing and then watching Ada do it and correcting her, sometimes with words, sometimes by simply taking the tool from Ada's hand and demonstrating the motion again until Ada's body understood what her mind had already grasped. The relationship was not charity. Mercy said so directly when Ada tried to thank her after the first week. "I am not here because you need help," Mercy said. "I am here because this is the first cranberry ground I have seen since Harwich, and my hands miss the work. You're giving me something too. Do not make it small by calling it charity." June. The construction took shape. Ada cut tamarack poles and sank them along the ditch edges to keep the walls from slumping. Mercy showed her how to brace them with cross pieces wedged at angles, a technique she had learned from watching her husband build barrel forms. Different material, same principle of distributed pressure. Jonah Pritchard appeared in the third week of June. 17, the blacksmith's apprentice, thin-wristed but clever with metal. He came to the bog because he had heard about it. Everyone had heard about it. And because he was curious in the particular way of young men who have spent their whole lives being told what to do and are interested in watching someone refuse. He brought scrap-strap iron that was too short or too bent for proper work, and he traded it for the promise of berries later. Ada needed the iron for the sluice gate. Jonah needed something to believe in that was not the forge. He fashioned hinge pins from bent rod stock. He straightened strapping that Ada used to brace the plank gate. He said very little, worked steadily, and ate whatever Ada and Mercy cooked without complaint, which at that point was mostly flour cakes and boiled cattail root. The sluice was Mercy's design and Ada's labor. 3 planks, salvaged from the shanty's ruined back wall, which Ada replaced with woven brush and daubed mud, set into a channel cut at the creek bend where the flow narrowed between 2 hummocks. Wedges instead of hinges, because hinges cost money Ada did not have. The wedges were tamarack heartwood, hard enough to hold but soft enough to drive with a stone. Pull the wedges and the planks dropped, blocking the flow and raising the water level behind them. Push the wedges back, and the planks lifted, and the water moved. It was crude. It leaked at the joints. It required constant adjustment, but it worked. When Ada dropped the first gate and watched the water rise in the ditch behind it, spreading out across Mother's bed in a slow, dark sheet that covered the vine runners, and then stopped, held by the ditch walls, controlled by the second ditch's overflow channel, she stood there for a long time without speaking. The water was doing what she told it to do. The bog was not fighting her. For the first time, it was answering. Mercy watched from the ditch edge and said nothing, but she nodded once, and the nod carried more weight than any word she had spoken. Tamsin came after dark. She appeared at the shanty carrying a bundle of pulled brush so large it hit her body, dropped it by the fire ring, and said, "I was clearing my uncle's fence line. This was extra." The brush was fresh cut and exactly the kind Ada needed for the windbreak on North Bed. Tamsin's uncle's fence line was a 1/4 mile in the other direction. Neither of them mentioned the lie. Tamsin came back 3 more times that week, always after dark, always with something that was extra. July brought heat and mosquitoes and the first real setback, a spring rise. Late, unexpected, driven by 3 days of rain that turned the creek into a brown torrent, washed out Ada's first ditch. The carefully braced walls collapsed inward. The tamarack poles she had sunk tilted and fell. Mud and water filled the channel in an hour, and when the rain stopped and Ada walked the damage, she found 3 weeks of labor reduced to a long, shallow trench that held water like a bathtub instead of moving it like a channel. She sat on a hummock beside the ruined ditch and did not cry. Crying required a kind of surrender she could not afford. Instead, she counted. 9 days to dig the original ditch, 3 days of rain to destroy it. She did not have 9 more days. The berries were forming. The harvest window was August through October. The winter flood had to be in place before the first hard freeze, which in this part of Wisconsin could come as early as late October. She rebuilt the ditch in 6 days, working from before dawn until after dark, eating in the field, sleeping in the ditch when exhaustion dropped her there. Mercy worked beside her for 4 of those days, and on the 5th morning could not straighten her back until noon. They did not discuss it. Mercy sat on a stump and directed while Ada dug, and the directing was worth almost as much as the digging because Mercy could see things Ada missed. A weak point in the bank, a root mass that needed cutting, a place where the water would undercut the wall if the grade was not changed. Other setbacks stacked. Ada sliced her palm on an ice-edged piece of sedge so deeply that Mercy packed the wound with sphagnum moss and wrapped it with a strip of cotton and told her she could not use that hand for 2 days. Ada used it the next morning and reopened the cut so badly that the blood did not stop for an hour. Ellery Vale's hired man, a thick-shouldered fellow named Carver, who never looked Ada in the eye, pulled 2 stakes from the creek line one night. Ada found them floating downstream in the morning and spent half a day resetting them. The first sand layer on creek bed was too thick in one corner, and a patch of uprights yellowed and died under the weight. Mercy found the dead patch and showed Ada the smothered growing tips without anger, but the lesson cost those vines and the fruit they would have carried. Ada kept account on the shanty wall, scratched marks with a nail, 1 per day, grouped in 7s. She could see the weeks vanishing. She could count the ditches finished, 3, and the ditches remaining 3 more, plus the overflow channels, plus the secondary gate Mercy said she needed for North Bed. She could count the vine beds cleared. Mother's bed mostly done. Creek bed half. North bed barely started. She could count the barrel hoops Jonah had bent from scrap, 9s, and the hoops she needed, 26 minimum. The math was a clock, and the clock was losing. In early August, Orrin Pike returned. He rode the gray mule to the bog's edge and dismounted and walked the ditches without invitation. Ada watched him from creek bed where she was on her knees pulling grass from between vine runners. She did not stop working. She did not greet him. She let him see. Orrin walked the 3 finished ditches. He tested the sluice gate with his boot. He looked at the vine beds, cleared now, green and low, and studded with the small, hard green nubs that would become berries. He looked at the sand layers. He looked at the shanty, patched and tight, with a wood pile growing beside it and a sorting rack Mercy had built from willow poles. Then he walked to where Ada knelt and stood over her. "It is not enough," he said. Ada's hands stopped in the vines. "You have 3 beds," Orrin said. "You have 1 gate. You have no barrels and no way to move them. The berries are green and small, and you do not know yet whether they will ripen or rot. And winter is 3 months away." 2.5, Ada said. 2.5, Orrin agreed. He looked at Mercy, who had come to stand at the ditch edge. "You taught her this?" "I showed her what I know," Mercy said. "She did the work." Orrin looked back at Ada. "The work is not the question. The question is whether the work is enough." He remounted the mule. "I hope it is. I do not believe it is. But I have been wrong before, and I will be wrong again, and it costs me nothing to say so." He rode away, and Ada went back to pulling grass, and her hands shook, not from cold, not from exhaustion, but from the particular tremor of hearing her own doubt spoken aloud by someone who had no reason to lie. September. The berries turned, not all at once and not evenly, mother's bed first, the fruit darkening from green to white, to pink to a red so deep it was almost black in the shade of the remaining tamarack. Creek bed followed, the berries smaller but firm, clustered thick on the uprights. North bed came last and lightest, the exposed vines producing fruit that reddened unevenly, some berries fully colored on one side and green on the other, as if the cold had interrupted them mid-thought. Mercy walked the beds each morning and estimated. If they picked clean, every ripe berry, no waste, no rot left on the vine, and if they sorted hard, they might fill 18 to 22 barrels. Mercy said 20 was the number to work toward, and anything past that was grace. Ada picked. She picked on her knees, her fingers working through the low vines, separating fruit from leaf and stem with a motion that Mercy had drilled into her hands until it was automatic. Thumb and two fingers, a gentle pull, drop into the bucket. Jonah built a crude wooden scoop with tines spaced wide enough to catch berries and let leaves pass through, and it sped the work by half. But it also bruised the fruit if used too roughly, and Ada had to learn the pressure. Enough to catch, not enough to crush. She filled her first barrel on September the 14th. 100 pounds of sorted, sound cranberries packed tight in a barrel Jonah had coopered from salvaged staves and the 9 hoops he had bent over the summer. The barrel sat in the shade of the shanty's north wall, and Ada put her hand on it and felt the cool wood and the weight of what was inside, and the feeling was not triumph. It was arithmetic. 1 barrel. 19 to go. Oren's doubt sat on her shoulder. Ellery's tax deadline sat on the other. And the sky, which had been warm and golden through September, began to show the flat gray light that meant the season was turning. Tamsin came openly now, not after dark, not with lies about extra brush. She came in the morning and picked beside Ada and said nothing about what had changed, but Ada knew. The berries were real. They existed. They were red and firm and filling barrels, and the sight of them had crossed some line in Tamsin's practical mind between foolish and possible. Mercy warned them both. "Blossoms are a promise," she said, looking at the vine beds where next year's buds were already forming in the leaf axils of the current year's uprights. "Fruit is a fact, but the fact does not last. Frost can still take everything that is not inside a barrel, and frost does not negotiate." She was talking about the harvest, but she was also talking about the vines themselves, the buds that would overwinter and produce next year's crop. Those buds were alive and exposed. They needed the winter flood to survive. If Ada could not get the water over them before the killing cold came, this year's harvest would be the first and last. The days shortened. The picking continued. Barrels filled, 5, then 8, then 12. Ada's hands were stained so dark with cranberry juice that the red would not wash out, and in town people stared at her fingers as if she had been handling something forbidden. And the temperature dropped 3 degrees in a single night, and Ada looked at the sky and saw the season running out ahead of her like a horse she could not catch. The cold came in late October, earlier than Mercy had hoped and exactly when Mercy had feared. It did not arrive gradually. It came the way winter comes to central Wisconsin, a gray wall moving south out of Superior Country, pushing warm air ahead of it like a broom pushing dust, and then the wall itself, wind, dropping pressure, and a temperature fall so steep that the creek began to skin over with ice before noon on the first day. Ada had 14 full barrels in the shanty. 3 more stood half-filled on the sorting rack, berries in buckets waiting to be graded. North bed still had fruit on the vine, not much, but enough to make the difference between 20 barrels and 17. Creek bed was picked clean. Mother's bed was nearly clean, with scattered late reddening fruit that Mercy had marked for one more pass. The first morning of the cold, Ada woke to frost on the inside of the shanty walls. Her water bucket had a crust of ice thick enough to hold the weight of the tin cup she dropped on it. Outside, the bog was silver. Every blade of grass, every vine tip, every exposed surface coated in rime that caught the low sun and glittered like something beautiful and hostile. Mercy stood at the sluice gate with her arms wrapped around herself and said, "We flood today, or we lose the vines." The winter flood, the thing Ada had been building toward all season. The water had to cover the vine beds fully, every upright, every bud, every runner, so that when the ice formed over the flood, it would seal the plants beneath a frozen blanket that held warmth from the ground and block the wind and the freeze-thaw cycles that killed exposed tissue. Too little water, and the vine tips poked through, exposed, and the wind stripped them bare. Too much water held too long, and the oxygen beneath the ice depleted, and the vines suffocated in the dark. But the fruit, the remaining fruit on North Bed, was not yet in barrels. Flooding North Bed meant drowning the unpicked berries. Holding the flood meant leaving the vine buds exposed to the wind that was already making the tamaracks creak. Ada stood between the sluice gate and the sorting rack and felt the two needs pulling in opposite directions: save the fruit or save the future. Mercy did not tell her what to do. Mercy watched. Ada made the choice in the time it took to draw one breath. She told Jonah to pick North Bed as fast as he could, every berry he could reach in 4 hours. She told Tamsin to sort what was already in buckets and pack the barrels. And she opened the sluice gate on Mother's bed and creek bed and began the winter flood on the 2 beds she had already cleared. The water moved. It crept across the vine mats, dark and slow, filling the spaces between uprights, climbing the stems, covering the buds. Ada watched it from the ditch edge and felt something she could not name. Not relief, not confidence, but the particular calm of a person who is committed to a course and cannot turn back. Then Tamsin arrived from town with news that broke the calm apart. Mabel Pritchard, Jonah's younger sister, 12 years old, had swollen gums and bruising on her legs. 2 other children in Berlin had the same symptoms. The town doctor called it winter mouth and recommended preserved greens, but there were no preserved greens. There was no fresh produce of any kind. The town had been eating salt pork, flour, and dried beans since the last garden harvest failed in September, and the bodies of children who needed more than starch and salt were beginning to show the cost. Scurvy, the word was not used, would not be used in its scientific sense for decades. But the reality was as old as any long winter. Without something fresh, without whatever it was in fruit and greens that kept gums firm and blood vessels whole, the body began to come apart. Sailors had known it for centuries. Frontier towns learned it every year, and every year they were surprised, as if winter had not done this before. Cranberries, tart, sour, packed with the thing that scurvy needed, stored in barrels in Ada's shanty. 14 barrels. The difference between tax money and empty hands. The difference between proving Ellery wrong and handing him the land. The second choice was harder than the first. If you are invested in Ada's fight, subscribe and stay with us, because the worst decision she makes this night is the one that saves more than the marsh. Ellery arrived at the bog the same afternoon, riding fast, his good horse lathered. He had heard about the sick children, and he had done the math faster than anyone. He offered to buy all 14 barrels, right now, cash, at $2 a barrel instead of $3, and ship them to Milwaukee on the morning freight. $28 in Ada's hand. Not enough for tax and winter supplies together, but enough for one or the other. His pitch was smooth. The town will not pay you. They will beg, and you will give, and you will have nothing. Sell to me now. Take the money. Let me handle the rest. Ada looked at the barrels. She looked at Ellery. She looked at Mercy, who stood in the doorway of the shanty with her arms crossed and her face unreadable. She broke open 3 barrels. She did not sell them. She carried the berries to town in buckets, on her back, 3 miles on a road that was frozen ruts and black ice. Tamsin helped. Jonah helped. They brought tart fruit to the families with sick children first. The Pritchards, the Nilsons, the family on the Mill Road, whose name Ada did not know. She did not give the berries free. She sold them at a price low enough that no family would refuse, and high enough that no one could call it charity. 15 cents a quart. Less than the berries were worth. More than nothing. For the families who could not pay even that, she traded labor for berries, a day's work on the bog in spring for a winter's supply of fruit. The trade was not sentiment, it was investment. She needed hands for the spring clearing, and these families needed their children's gums to stop bleeding. Ellery watched the distribution from across the street. His expression did not change, but Ada saw him recalculate, saw him understand that she had chosen influence over cash, community debt over currency, and that the math she was running was longer than his. The cold deepened. The second night dropped to below 0. The wind came from the northwest with nothing between it and the bog but 200 miles of frozen lake and flat ground, and it hit the exposed vine beds on North Bed like a blade. Ada was at the sluice, alone. Mercy had been checking the water level on Creek Bed when the ice shifted under her feet. Her boot went through. She caught herself on the ditch edge but twisted sideways, and her hip, the left hip, the one that already ached in cold weather, struck the frozen bank with a sound Ada heard from 20 yards away. Mercy went down and did not get up. Jonah carried Mercy to the shanty. Ada stayed at the sluice because someone had to, because the wind was pushing the floodwater sideways and exposing vine tips on the northern edge of Mother's Bed, and if those tips froze dry, the buds beneath them were dead, and next year's crop with them. She worked in the dark. She worked on her hands and knees because the wind was too strong to stand upright on the exposed ditch bank. She packed mud and frozen sedge against the low side where water was draining away. She adjusted the gate, pulling one wedge, driving another, to redirect flow toward the exposed corner. Her hands stopped working as hands and became clubs of cold that she forced against the wood and the mud by leaning her whole body weight into them. The temperature was below 0. The wind made it worse. She could not feel her face. She could not feel her fingers. She could feel only the water moving under the ice and the vine tips that were either covered or not, and she would not know which until morning. At some point, she did not know when. She lay flat on the ditch bank and pressed her face against the ice and closed her eyes, and the cold was so total that it stopped being pain and became a kind of silence, and in the silence she heard Mercy's voice from the first day. "You are killing them." She opened her eyes. She was lying on ice in the dark and wind that could kill her in an hour, and the sluice gate needed one more adjustment, and she was the only person on the bog who could make it. She crawled to the gate. She drove the wedge. The water moved. In the morning, the ice had sealed over Mother's Bed and Creek Bed. The flood was level. The vine tips were covered. Ada checked by cutting a hole in the ice with the berry knife and reaching underneath until her fingers found the top of an upright, submerged, intact, the bud at its tip firm and alive beneath a 1/4 inch of frozen water. North Bed was not so fortunate. The exposed edge, the part she had not been able to reach in the dark, had lost a 1/4 of its vine tips to wind and frost. The buds were brown. The tissue was soft, dead, but only the edge. The rest of North Bed, flooded in time, held. Creek Bed held. Mother's Bed held. A neighbor's exposed berry patch 1/2 mile east, unmanaged, unflooded, left to the wind, had blackened completely. Another man's low meadow, overflooded with stagnant water he could not control, smelled of rot within 3 days. Ada's beds, managed with ditches and a crude plank gate, and the knowledge of a Cape Cod woman who was now lying in a shanty unable to stand, had survived. 17 full barrels saved for food and sale, 3 partial barrels distributed during the emergency, 2 vine beds with living buds beneath the ice, 1 woman with frozen hands and a cracked rib she did not notice for 2 days, sitting on the ditch bank in the first gray light of a winter morning, looking at her marsh, breathing. Mercy's hip was not broken, but it would never move the same way again, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said it that morning. What Mercy said from the sleeping shelf when Ada came into the shanty with ice in her hair and blood on her hands from a cut she did not remember getting was this: "Did the water hold?" The water held. Mercy closed her eyes. Ada sat on the floor beside the shelf and pressed her frozen hands against the warm iron pot, and the pain of the blood returning to her fingers was so sharp that she bent double, and the sound she made was not a cry and not a laugh, but something between the two that meant, "I am still here, and the vines are still here, and we are not finished." The thaw came in late March, and Ada cut the first hole through the ice on Mother's bed with a hand axe, and reached into water so cold her bones ached, and she found what she was looking for: living tissue. Green beneath the bark of the uprights, firm buds at the tips, roots anchored in sand and peat below. The vines had survived. She checked creek bed next. The same. Living uprights, intact buds, runners that had put out new root growth beneath the flood over winter. The ice had done what Mercy said it would do: held warmth from the ground, blocked the wind, kept the freeze-thaw cycles from heaving the roots loose. North Bed told a harder story. The center held. The southern 2/3, where Ada's flood had covered the vines before the worst cold, showed green tissue and firm buds. But the northern quarter, the exposed edge she had not reached in the dark that night, was brown and soft. Dead uprights, dead buds. A strip of lost vines 20 feet wide and 60 feet long that would produce nothing this year and would need years to regrow. The damage was real. It was also proof. The vines that were covered had lived. The vines that were not covered had died. The method worked, and the failure proved it as clearly as the success. Orrin Pike came back in April. He came without the mule this time. He walked, which meant he had come deliberately, not on his way somewhere else. He wore his good coat, the one Ada had seen at town meetings, and he carried a walking stick he did not need but used anyway because Orrin Pike did nothing without a reason. He walked the beds. He walked the ditches. He knelt at Mother's bed and pulled a vine upright from beneath the melting ice edge and held it between his fingers the way he had held a handful of peat the year before. Except this time he was not looking for evidence of worthlessness. He was looking at green tissue and finding it. He walked to where Ada stood at the sluice gate, draining the winter flood in slow stages the way Mercy had taught her. Never too fast, never all at once. Let the roots adjust to air gradually, or the shock would stunt the spring growth. "I said you could not plant a meal in a swamp," Orrin said. Ada waited. "I was wrong." He looked at the vine beds, at the ditch network, at the crude sluice gate with its tamarack wedges and plank walls. "You did not plant a meal. You grew the only thing that belonged here, and you kept it alive through a winter that killed every exposed patch in the township." Ada said nothing for a moment. Then, "The north edge died." "The north edge was exposed," Orrin said. "Everything exposed died, yours included, but everything you covered lived. That is not luck. That is method." He drove his walking stick into the soft peat beside the ditch and left it there, upright, like a post marking a boundary. "I will tell people what I saw," he said. "I will tell them the truth. You built a marsh. It held." He walked back toward town, and Ada watched him go, and the walking stick stood in the peat like a small declaration. Tamsin's conversion was quieter and had already happened before she named it. She had picked beside Ada through the harvest. She had hauled berries to town during the scurvy emergency. She had opened the sluice gate when Ada told her to, and trusted the math without understanding it. But she had done all of this the way a person follows instructions in a crisis. Because the alternative was worse, not because she believed the method was sound. The conversion came in early May, when Tamsin's mother fell ill with a cough that would not break, and Tamsin brought her a jar of cranberry preserves Ada had put up from bruised fruit too soft for barrels. The preserves were tart enough to make her mother grimace, sweet enough with a scraping of hoarded maple sugar to swallow, and within a week the cough had eased and the color had returned to her mother's face. Tamsin did not attribute the recovery to cranberries. She was too practical for that. But she came to the bog the next day and asked Ada to show her the vine beds, not as a helper following orders, but as a woman asking questions. Which beds produced the most fruit? How did Ada know when to flood and when to drain? What made the sand work? Why did some uprights fruit and others only run? Ada answered every question. She answered them kneeling in the vine mats with her hands in the peat, the way Mercy had answered her, because this was how the knowledge moved, not through lectures or books, but through two people on their knees in the mud, looking at the same plant, one of them pointing and the other one learning to see. Tamsin's uncle owned 3 acres of wet meadow east of Ada's bog. By June, Tamsin had begun clearing brush from the meadow's edge, looking for native cranberry runners in the sedge. The community came in ones and twos, not as a crowd. A woman named Lena Stensland brought her 12-year-old daughter to the bog and asked Ada if the girl could learn to sort berries. The daughter had quick hands and a good eye, and Ada showed her the bounce test. Drop a sound berry on a flat board and it bounced. Drop a soft one and it landed dead. The girl practiced for an hour and then sorted a bushel without a single bad berry passing through. A farmer named Peter Haugen walked his low meadow with Ada and asked her to look at the native growth in his wet corner. She found thin cranberry runners under a mat of wiregrass and told him what she saw. Not a crop yet, not even close, but the raw material for one if he was willing to spend 2 years clearing, ditching, sanding, and learning to read the water. He asked how much it would cost. She told him the truth. Almost nothing in money, almost everything in labor. The storekeeper Fenton, who had refused Ada credit for nails, now offered barrel hoops at cost. He did not apologize for the refusal. He simply adjusted his prices downward and greeted her by name instead of avoiding her eyes, and the adjustment was its own kind of admission. Each of these moments was small. None of them was dramatic, but together they formed a shift in the way the town saw Ada Whitlock and the land she worked. The bog girl was becoming something else, not yet respected, not yet trusted completely, but watched with a different quality of attention. The entertainment had turned into curiosity, and curiosity was the first step toward belief. Ellery Vale watched the shift and did not like it. He had built his position in Berlin on the assumption that water rights and marsh access were negotiable commodities, things to be accumulated quietly, leveraged slowly, and sold dear when the moment came. Ada's success threatened that position, not because her 46 acres mattered in themselves, but because her method, if it spread, meant that every wet meadow and bog in the township had potential value that the owners might recognize before Ellery could buy it. His first response was quiet. He told the town board that Ada's creek gate was a flood risk to downstream hayground. He presented the claim as public safety, not personal interest. Two board members, men who owed Ellery favors for brokerage work, agreed to discuss it at the next meeting. His second response was sharper. He hired a man to survey the creek from its source above Ada's Bog to its junction with the Meakin River 2 miles south. The surveyor's map, when it was finished, would show the exact point where the creek crossed from public right-of-way onto Ada's deed and back again. If there was any ambiguity in the boundary, any gap in the legal description, any overlap with the road easement, Ellery would find it and use it. Ada learned about the surveyor from Jonah, who had seen the man pacing the creek with a chain and a compass. She stood in the sorting shed she had built that spring, raised floor, slatted racks, a cold wall facing north, barrel storage along the east side, Oswam, and understood that the fight had changed shape. Ellery was no longer trying to buy her land. He was trying to control her water. Mercy Toby spent the winter and spring in the shanty, her hip healing slowly and incompletely. She could walk by April but not kneel. She could stand for an hour but not bend. The joint that had let her drop to one knee in the vine beds with the easy grace of long practice now locked and ground when she moved wrong, and the pain showed in her face even when she did not mention it, which was most of the time. She and Ada worked together through the spring in a way that was different from the year before. The teaching was finished. What replaced it was collaboration. Two people who understood the same work discussing it as equals, disagreeing about methods, and resolving the disagreements through trial. They argued about sand depth. Mercy believed half an inch was the maximum, and anything more risked smothering. Ada had watched the wind-blown patches on Mother's bed and thought 3/4 of an inch might encourage faster rooting in areas where the peat was especially loose. They tried both. Ada's thicker layer produced more root growth, but one dead patch where the sand had settled unevenly. Mercy's thinner layer produced steady growth with no losses. They compromised at 5/8 of an inch, a number that meant nothing as science and everything as partnership. They argued about flooding timing. Mercy's Cape Cod training said flood after the first hard frost and hold through winter. Ada's Wisconsin observation said the frost came earlier here and the wind was worse, and waiting for the first hard frost meant losing the edge vines the way she had lost North Bed's northern quarter. Ada wanted to flood earlier, a shallow protective layer before the worst cold, deepened as the temperature dropped. Mercy resisted. They tested both approaches on different sections of creek bed. Ada's early flood lost less vine tissue. The evidence settled it, but Mercy gave ground slowly, and the slowness taught Ada something about the difference between knowing and accepting. In the long evenings, with the lantern burning low and the sound of spring peepers rising from every ditch and pool on the bog, Mercy told stories. Not lessons, stories. The Harwich yards where she had worked bent double over vine beds that stretched to the horizon. Her husband, Tobias, who built barrels so tight they held water, not because cranberry barrels needed to hold water, but because he believed a barrel was a promise, and a promise should not leak. The first time she had seen a winter flood done right, the ice forming clean and clear over the vines like glass over a painting, and the feeling of knowing that something alive was being held safe beneath something frozen. She told Ada about the women she had worked beside now, sorters and pickers, mostly women whose names never appeared in any record, but whose hands had built the industry from wild bogs into managed marshes. Women who knew that a soft berry in the barrel was a betrayal of the buyer and a betrayal of the vine that had produced it. Women who sorted by touch in the dark when the candles ran low, their fingers reading the fruit the way a blind person reads a face. Ada listened and understood that Mercy was giving her something more than stories. She was giving her a lineage. A chain of knowledge passed from hand to hand, woman to woman, across decades and 1,000 miles of coastline and prairie. The notebook Ada's mother had kept was one link. Mercy's 11 seasons in the Harwich yards were another. Ada's own work on the bog, the ditches, the sluice, the sand, the flood, the long crawl on the ice in the dark, was the newest link, not yet finished, not yet strong, but real. In late June, Mercy told Ada she was leaving. Her sister's family was returning east. Her hip would not survive another Wisconsin winter. The cold settled into the joint like rust into iron, and each freeze-thaw cycle ground it worse. She had relatives in Connecticut who would take her in, not as charity, but as family, and she wanted to see salt water again before she died. Ada did not argue. She wanted to. She felt the argument building in her chest, the selfish, terrified argument that said, "You cannot go. I am not ready. I do not know enough yet." But she looked at Mercy's face, at the lines around her mouth that deepened when the hip ached, at the way she held the left side of her body slightly tilted, even when standing still, and the argument died before Ada spoke it. Instead, she said, "What do I still need to learn?" Mercy considered the question for a long time. They were sitting on the sorting shed's raised floor, their legs dangling over the edge, watching the evening light turn the bog gold and copper and then dark. "You know the vines," Mercy said. "You know the water. You know the sand and the frost and the sort. What you do not know yet is when to stop. You will want to control everything, the water, the beds, the growth, the timing, and the marsh will let you think you can. It will behave for 3 years or 5 years, and you will believe you are the one making it work. And then a year will come when nothing you do is right. The frost comes early, the flood rises wrong, the berries rot on the vine, and you will have to decide whether the marsh has failed or you have failed, and the answer will be neither. The answer will be that the marsh is alive, and alive means it does not always obey." She reached into her coat and took out her cranberry scoop, the one she had carried from Cape Cod, wooden-handled, iron-tined, worn smooth by 11 seasons of use. She set it on the floor between them. "Do not make the marsh obey you," Mercy said. "Learn when it is speaking." She left the next morning with her sister's family on a wagon headed east. Ada stood at the boundary stake and watched the wagon until it disappeared into the tamarack. And then she stood there for a while longer, not because she expected the wagon to come back, but because the space Mercy had occupied on the bog was suddenly empty, and emptiness takes time to absorb. The scoop sat on the shelf in the sorting shed. Ada did not use it that season. She kept it there the way a person keeps a letter they have already read, not for the information, but for the hand that wrote it. The secondary crisis came in the second spring, and it came when Ada was not there. She had built the operation through the winter, a better sorting shed, a second sluice gate Jonah had reinforced with iron strapping, 3 new ditch screens to stop debris from clogging the channels, and a hand-pulled sled for sand spreading that cut the work from days to hours. She had leased the 3-acre wet meadow from Tamsin's uncle, not for cash but for a quarter share of the crop, and had begun clearing it the way she had cleared the original bog, vine by vine, ditch by ditch, with patience that looked like stubbornness, and stubbornness that looked like patience. In late April, she hitched a ride on a freight wagon to Oshkosh to meet a commission buyer who wanted to discuss barrel contracts for the coming harvest. It was the first time she had left the bog for more than a day since Mercy's departure. Tamsin was in charge. Jonah checked the sluice gates morning and evening. The warm spell came first. 3 days of unseasonable heat that pushed the buds forward, coaxing them out of dormancy weeks early. The vines responded the way vines always do to warmth, with growth. with the opening of tissue that had been sealed tight against the cold, with the small green flags of new leaves emerging from buds that should have stayed closed for another month. Then the frost came back. Tamsin saw the temperature fall on the thermometer Ada had hung on the shanty wall, a gift from Orrin Pike, who had decided that if the girl was going to farm water, she ought to at least know how cold it was. The mercury dropped below freezing at sunset. It was still falling at midnight. The wind shifted north. Tamsin had watched Ada flood the beds twice. She had helped with the gates. She had listened to Mercy's lessons about vine tips and oxygen and the difference between held water and stagnant water. But she had never been alone at the sluice at midnight with the temperature dropping and new growth exposed and no one to ask. She went anyway. She opened the gate on Mother's bed and watched the water rise in the ditches. She opened the gate on Creek Bed and adjusted the flow. She did not flood North Bed because North Bed's secondary gate was stiff, and she was afraid of forcing it and breaking the mechanism Jonah had built. The water covered Mother's bed by 2 in the morning. It covered Creek Bed by 3. Tamsin walked the ditch edges with the cracked lantern and checked vine tips and found them submerged, safe, the new growth protected under a thin sheet of water that was already beginning to skim with ice. North Bed took the frost bare. The new growth, early, tender, pushed out by the warm spell, froze on the exposed uprights. Tamsin found the damage at dawn and stood at the bed's edge and looked at the browning tips and said a word that Ada would have used in the same situation, and then she said another one. When Ada returned 2 days later, Tamsin met her at the boundary stake and delivered the report with the precision of someone who has been rehearsing the words for 48 hours. Mother's bed and Creek Bed are fine. I flooded them in time. North Bed lost its new growth on the west half. I could not get the gate open. I am sorry. Ada looked at the beds. She looked at Tamsin. She looked at North Bed, where the frost-burned tips were already curling brown against the green of the surviving growth. You saved 2 beds, Ada said. Mercy could not have done better. Tamsin shook her head. Mercy would have gotten the gate open. Mercy had 11 seasons. You had 1 night. Ada put her hand on Tamsin's shoulder. You heard the marsh speaking. You listened. That is the part that matters. Tamsin looked at Ada's hand on her shoulder and then looked away, and something in her face changed, not softened because Tamsin did not soften, but settled, the way a post settles into ground that has finally accepted it. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it before the hard season comes. Ellery's surveyor finished his work in May and delivered the map to Ellery's office in Berlin. Within a week, Ellery filed a petition with the town board claiming that Ada's creek gate obstructed a natural waterway and endangered neighboring properties. He asked for an order requiring her to remove the gate or submit to supervised water management by a board-appointed agent, which in practice meant Ellery's man Carver standing at Ada's sluice deciding when and how much she could flood. Ada heard about the petition from Orrin Pike, who heard about it at the board meeting, and walked to the bog the same evening to tell her. He's not wrong about the law, Orrin said. Creek water crosses property lines. If your gate holds water that would naturally flow to downstream parcels, the downstream owners have standing to complain. Ellery has gotten 3 of them to sign. Do those 3 owners have crops that need the water? Ada asked. No. They have hay ground that floods in spring and dries in summer. The water does them no good either way, but Ellery has told them it might, someday, and someday is enough for a signature. Ada sat in the sorting shed and thought about Mercy's lesson about control. The marsh was alive. Ellery was alive. The law was alive. None of them would obey her. She could not fight Ellery the way she fought wiregrass, by pulling it out one root at a time. He had money, connections, and a surveyor's map. She had barrels and a gate. But she also had something Ellery did not: neighbors who had eaten her cranberries through the winter and whose children had recovered from bleeding gums because of fruit that came from the bog he wanted to control. Ada spent a week walking. She walked to Peter Haugen's low meadow and talked about water. She walked to Lena Stensland's homestead and talked about berries. She walked to 3 other families with wet ground and native vines, and talked about what a managed marsh could produce if the water was controlled rather than fought. She did not ask for favors. She did not ask anyone to oppose Ellery. She asked them to think about what their wet ground could become if they worked it the way she had worked hers, and what would happen to that possibility if one man controlled the creek. By the end of the week, she had 5 families willing to sign a grower's agreement, a written document drafted by the school teacher who had the best handwriting in Berlin that established shared water rules for the creek system. Each signer agreed to maintain their own gates and ditches, to notify downstream neighbors before flooding or draining, and to resolve disputes through a meeting of signers rather than through the town board. The agreement was not a legal fortress. It was a piece of paper with names on it, but it did something Ellery's petition could not. It showed the board that Ada was not a single woman hoarding water. She was the center of a network of growers who depended on the system she had built and who had a shared interest in maintaining it. The board hearing was scheduled for the first week of October, Harvest Week. The timing was not an accident. Ellery knew that Ada would be pulling berries, sorting, packing, and hauling during the busiest days of her year. He expected her to ask for a postponement. He expected to use the postponement against her, delay as evidence of disorganization, of a woman who could not manage her time, her water, and her legal obligations simultaneously. Ada did not ask for a postponement. She marked the hearing date on her wall with a nail scratch, right beside the harvest count, and went back to work. The vines on Mother's bed were heavy with fruit. Creek Bed had recovered from the previous year's hard picking and was producing more than Mercy had predicted. Even North Bed, frost damaged twice now, was bearing on its protected interior. The berries reddened through September, and Ada picked and sorted and packed, and the barrels filled, and the number on the wall climbed: 22, 25, 28. She was not just surviving anymore. She was building something, and the something had weight and shape and a future that extended past the next winter. But the future depended on the water, and the water depended on the hearing, and the hearing depended on whether a room full of men would listen to a woman who farmed a swamp. The question sat in the sorting shed like an uninvited guest, and Ada worked around it and through it and despite it, and she did not let it stop her hands. The hearing was held in the Berlin Town Hall on the first Tuesday of October, 1873. The room smelled of wet wool and wood smoke, and the particular sourness of men who had walked through mud to sit on hard benches and argue about water. 14 people attended. Ellery Vale sat at the front with his surveyor's map unrolled on a table, the edges weighted with stones he had brought from his own property, which was the kind of detail Ellery attended to. Everything prepared, everything deliberate, everything designed to suggest that he was the reasonable man in the room and the woman who farmed the swamp was the problem. Ada arrived carrying a canvas sack. She wore her work dress, the one with cranberry stains on the cuffs that would not wash out, and her boots were muddy because she had been at the sluice gate that morning, checking the water level before walking to town. She did not look like a person who had prepared for a legal proceeding. She looked like a person who had interrupted her work to attend one, which was exactly the impression she intended. Ellery spoke first. He was good at speaking. He laid out his case with the calm authority of a man who has rehearsed every sentence. Ada's gate obstructed a natural waterway. The obstruction held water that would otherwise flow to downstream parcels. 3 downstream property owners had signed complaints. The gate had been built without board approval. The operator of the gate was a single woman with no engineering training and no supervision, and the risk to neighboring land was unacceptable. He used the word risk 7 times. He did not use the word cranberry once. He framed the issue as water management, not agriculture, because water management sounded like a public concern and agriculture sounded like a woman's garden. When he finished, the board chairman, a mill owner named Dressler who owed Ellery nothing and disliked owing anyone, asked Ada if she wished to respond. Ada opened the canvas sack. She laid out a ditch map she had drawn on a flour sack with ink made from berry juice and soot. The map showed every ditch, every gate, every overflow channel, every bed, and the water levels she maintained at each stage of the season: spring drain, summer hold, fall harvest drain, winter flood. She had marked the measurements in her own hand, and the measurements were precise because Mercy had taught her that precision was the difference between a grower and a guesser. She laid out barrel counts. 17 barrels the first year, 28 the second, with 3 distributed during the scurvy emergency. Projected 35 for the current harvest, still in progress. Each number scratched onto a shingle with a nail, the way she had scratched the first calculations the day Tamsin found her counting berries on a hanging scale. She laid out signed statements from 4 families who had received cranberries during the winter sickness: the Pritchards, the Nielsens, the family on the Mill Road. Their name was Greendheim, and Ada had learned it since. A 4th family, the Espelins, whose grandmother had been unable to keep food down until someone brought her stewed cranberries sweetened with maple sugar. She laid out Tamsin's frost log, a record Tamsin had begun keeping after her night alone at the sluice, noting the date, the temperature, the wind direction, and the water level on each bed every morning and evening. The log covered 5 months and filled both sides of a long strip of birch bark. She laid out Jonah's repaired gate hinge, the piece of strap iron he had straightened and rebent to fix the secondary gate that had stuck when Tamsin needed it, not as evidence of engineering, but as evidence of maintenance. The gate was being cared for, the system was being tended, and she laid out Mercy's old cranberry scoop. She set it on the table beside the surveyor's map, and the contrast said everything she did not need to say in words. Ellery had a map drawn by a hired man. Ada had a tool carried from Cape Cod by a woman who had worked cranberry marshes for 11 seasons and had chosen to teach what she knew to a girl on a frozen bog in Wisconsin. Ada did not make a speech. She said, "The map shows where the water goes. The barrel counts show what the water produces. The statements show who the water fed. The frost log shows how the water is managed. The gate hinge shows that the system is maintained, and the scoop belongs to the woman who taught me that held water keeps a marsh alive and bad water kills it." She looked at Ellery. "I am not hoarding water. I am using it. Every family on this creek can see my ditch levels from the road. Every family on this creek was invited to sign a water agreement. Every family on this creek except yours, Mr. Vale, because you do not grow anything. You buy and sell. You do not need the water for a crop. You need it for leverage." The room was quiet. Ellery's surveyor's map lay on the table with its precise lines and professional lettering, and beside it lay a flour sack map drawn in berry ink, and the board looked at both, and the choice was not between 2 maps. It was between 2 kinds of knowledge, the kind you hire and the kind you earn. Orrin Pike stood up. He had not been invited to speak. He was not on the agenda. But he was Orrin Pike, and in Berlin that meant he spoke when he chose to. "I have seen men drown good land with worse judgment than hers," Orrin said. He pointed at Ada without looking at her. "She measures before she opens a gate. She floods by the thermometer and drains by the vine. I told her 2 years ago that nothing would grow on that bog. I was wrong. Ellery Vale told her the same thing and offered $12 for the deed. He was not wrong. He was lying. He knew the water had value. He wanted to own it. Ellery's expression did not change. His hands, resting on the table, did not move, but something behind his eyes shifted. The recalculation of a man who has just discovered that the room is not arranged the way he planned it. The board denied the petition. The vote was 4-1, with the single dissent coming from a member who owed Ellery a brokerage debt and who looked at the floor when he voted. The chairman, Dressler, added a note to the record. Any future complaints about water management on the creek would require evidence of actual damage, not projected risk. Ellery gathered his map, rolled it carefully, and walked out of the town hall without speaking to anyone. He did not slam the door. He did not make a scene. He receded, the way a man recedes when the ground he was standing on turns out to belong to someone else. His full resolution came the following year, and it was practical, not sentimental. The 1874 harvest was poor across the region. A wet summer encouraged fungal growth. Berries softened on the vine. Growers who had not sorted rigorously found rot spreading through their barrels within weeks of packing. The commission buyers in Oshkosh and Milwaukee, burned by bad fruit the previous year, became cautious. Prices dropped. Orders shrank. Ada's barrels held. Her sorting was Mercy's sorting. Reject more than you keep. Trust nothing soft. Pack only fruit that bounced. Her stored cranberries lasted through the winter without a single barrel turning. When other growers' supplies failed and the buyers came looking for sound fruit, Ada had it. Ellery Vale, who brokered sales for 3 other marsh operations in the township, found himself holding contracts he could not fill because his growers' fruit had gone soft. He needed sound barrels. Ada had them. He came to the bog on a November afternoon, riding the same good horse, wearing the same careful smile. He asked to buy 2 barrels at full price, $3 each, the rate he had once offered to undercut it too. Ada sold them to him. She did not gloat. She did not remind him of the $12 offer or the petition or the surveyor's map. She weighed the barrels on the sorting shed scale, accepted $6 in paper currency, and handed him a receipt written on a shingle. Ellery looked at the shingle. He looked at the barrels. He looked at Ada. "You sort harder than anyone I have dealt with," he said. "I had a good teacher," Ada said. It was not forgiveness, it was commerce. But commerce between equals, conducted on Ada's ground, on Ada's terms, at Ada's price. And Ellery, who understood power better than anyone in Berlin, understood what the transaction meant. He would not challenge her again. Not because he respected her. Ellery did not respect anyone whose interests did not align with his, but because challenging her had become more expensive than buying from her, and Ellery always followed the cheaper path. Within 2 years, his other growers began asking Ada for sorting advice. Within 3, 2 of them had adopted her water rules. Ellery found himself brokering fruit that was managed according to Ada Whitlock's methods, and the irony was not lost on him, though he never mentioned it. Jonah Pritchard became a work partner before he became anything else. He had been at the bog since the first summer, the thin-wristed blacksmith's apprentice who brought scrap iron and stayed because curiosity turned into commitment. By the 2nd year, he was building gates and screens full-time, his metalwork improving as the demands of the marsh taught him things the forge never had. He learned to read water levels by the sound the creek made at the sluice. A high note meant full flow. A low note meant the gate was holding, and silence meant a blockage that needed clearing before it backed up and flooded the wrong bed. He and Ada worked side by side through the 3rd and 4th seasons, and the partnership was built the way the marsh was built. Slowly, through shared labor, through arguments about gate design and ditch grades, and whether it was worth the iron to build a 3rd sluice or better to improve the 2 they had. They argued about expansion. Ada wanted to develop the leased meadow faster. Jonah said the iron supply could not keep up, and they would end up with ditches and no gates, which was worse than no ditches at all. They argued about money. Ada wanted to reinvest every dollar into the marsh. Jonah said a person who never spent a dollar on herself would burn out before the marsh reached full production. The arguments were real. They were not performed for an audience or softened for comfort. Ada had opinions forged in 2 years of solitary labor, and Jonah had opinions forged in metal. And when the two collided, the sparks were genuine. But the arguments always ended the same way, with both of them standing at the sluice or kneeling in the vine beds, looking at the same problem and finding the answer together. The courtship, if it could be called that, happened in the sorting shed during late autumn nights when the barrels were being packed and the lantern threw their shadows against the wall. It happened during sled repairs when their hands touched over the same bolt. It happened during the hauling of barrels to the freight road when Jonah lifted one end and Ada lifted the other, and the weight between them was shared so evenly that neither could have carried it alone. Jonah asked Ada to marry him in the spring of 1875. He asked while they were knee-deep in a ditch, clearing a winter's worth of debris from the main channel. He did not kneel because he was already kneeling. He did not offer a ring because he had spent his money on gate iron. He said, "I would like to build this with you for longer than a season." Ada said yes, but she said it with the condition that Jonah had expected because he understood who she was. The deed to the bog would remain in her name alone. The water agreement would list her as the primary signer. The operation was hers. The partnership was theirs. The distinction mattered, and Jonah did not argue it, because Jonah understood that Ada had been given worthless land by a man who expected her to fail, and she would not put her name second on anything again. They married in June at the Berlin church. Tamsin stood beside Ada. Orrin Pike attended and brought a new thermometer as a wedding gift, better than the one he had given before, with markings in both Fahrenheit and a second scale he said was European. The storekeeper Fenton donated 2 pounds of white sugar, which was the most expensive thing he had ever given anyone, and which Ada used to sweeten cranberry preserves that she served at the wedding supper. Ellery Vale did not attend. He sent a barrel hoop bent into a circle with no note. Ada hung it on the sorting shed wall. Jonah said it was either a peace offering or an insult, and Ada said it could be both, and they left it at that. The years compressed the way years do when work replaces crisis as the organizing principle of a life. The operation grew. Not explosively. Ada did not trust explosion, having seen what uncontrolled growth did to vine beds and to people, but steadily the way a well-managed marsh grows. 1 bed cleared per season, 1 ditch extended, 1 gate improved. By 1878, the original 46 acres were divided into 18 working acres under cranberry management and 28 acres of buffer marsh, tamarack stand, and creek corridor, that Ada left wild because Mercy had told her a marsh needed wild edges the way a barrel needed hoops. The unmanaged parts held the managed parts together. The harvest rose. 17 barrels the first year, 28 the second, 35 the third. By the 5th year, with the leased meadow in production and 2 additional beds cleared on the original bog, Ada shipped more than 100 barrels to the Oshkosh Commission market. By the 8th year, the number passed 200. In a strong year, warm spring, clean pollination, dry harvest, no late frost, she could push past 300, though those years were rare, and Ada never counted on them. She hired women. Lena Stensland's daughter, who had learned the bounce test at 12, became the head sorter at 17. 2 Nielsen sisters picked through the harvest season and earned more per week than they could make doing laundry in town. A widow named Barbara Flatten, who had lost her homestead to debt the year before, worked the sorting shed through the winter and learned the barrel packing technique Mercy had taught Ada, and the barrels Barbro packed were so tight and so clean that the Oshkosh buyers began requesting them by name. Tamsin ran the East Meadow. She had developed her uncle's 3 acres into a producing marsh using Ada's methods: the same ditches, the same sand, the same flooding schedule, and had added refinements of her own. She discovered that a thin layer of marsh hay spread over the vine beds in early spring retained moisture during dry weeks and suppressed the wiregrass that was the eternal enemy of clean picking. Ada adopted the technique on her own beds, and the improvement was measurable: fewer weeds, better fruit set, less labor per acre. Jonah built. He built gates from iron he now bought new instead of scavenging from scrap. He built a hand scoop with lighter tines and a wider mouth that could harvest a quart in the time Ada's original took to harvest a pint. He built a sand sled with runners that rode over the vine mats without crushing them, and the sled could be pulled by one person and spread an even layer across a 30-foot bed in an hour. He built a cold storage room dug into the north side of a hill near the sorting shed, lined with straw and tamarack bark, where barrels kept through the winter without a single one turning. Ada taught. She taught Peter Haugen's son how to read a vine bed for signs of overcrowding. She taught Lena Stensland's daughter how to judge water depth by the sound of a pole tapped against the ditch bottom. She taught the Grindheim family how to build a sluice gate with wedges instead of hinges, the same way Mercy had taught her. And when the youngest Grindheim boy asked why wedges were better than hinges, Ada said, "Because wedges do not rust and they do not cost money, and on a cranberry marsh you will always have more wood than iron." She taught freely. She did not hoard knowledge the way Ellery hoarded leverage. She gave away sorting techniques and flooding schedules and sand-spreading methods, because she understood something that Ellery never would. The more growers who succeeded, the more barrels the buyers wanted, and the more barrels the buyers wanted, the higher the price climbed for everyone. A single marsh was a curiosity. A dozen marshes were a market. By 1880, the creek that crossed Ada's bog fed water to 7 managed cranberry operations. The grower's agreement she had drafted on a piece of paper with the school teacher's handwriting now had 11 signers and a set of water rules that were specific enough to prevent flooding disputes and flexible enough to survive the unpredictable springs that Wisconsin delivered like tests of faith. Ada did not call herself the founder of anything. She called herself a grower, but the other growers called her something else. They called her by her name, Ada. The way people use a name when it has become a shorthand for a way of doing things. Ada's method, Ada's sort, Ada's flood timing. The name traveled ahead of the woman, and when new settlers with wet ground asked how to make a worthless marsh produce, someone always said, "Talk to Ada Whitlock on the Sour Sink." Except nobody called it the Sour Sink anymore. On barrel labels and freight manifests and the county assessor's books, the land was listed as Whitlock Marsh. Ada had not asked for the name change. It had happened the way place names happen, through use, through repetition, through the slow replacement of what a place was called by what a place had become. In winter, when the harvest was packed and the barrels were shipped and the flood was down and the ice was sealed, Ada still walked the marsh. She walked it the way Mercy had walked the vine beds, slowly, carefully, with attention to what was beneath her feet. She carried a pole and tapped the ice and listened for hollow places, because hollow meant the water level had dropped and the vine tips might be exposed, and exposure meant damage. She checked the sluice gates. She checked the ditch screens. She checked the thermometer Orrin had given her and recorded the reading in a notebook she had begun keeping the year Mercy left. Not a copy of her mother's notebook, but a continuation of it, written in Ada's hand, in Ada's words, with Ada's observations added to the knowledge her mother had gathered and Mercy had deepened. Jonah walked with her sometimes. Their children, a daughter born in 1877, a son born in 1879, walked with her when they were old enough. The daughter learned to read vine beds before she learned to read books. The son learned to tap ice before he learned to saddle a horse. They grew up on a marsh that their mother had built from nothing, and they understood, the way children understand things they have always known, that the land beneath their feet was alive, and that alive meant it required attention, not just during the harvest, but always. Ada's hands never lost the cranberry stain. The red had settled into the creases of her palms and the skin beneath her nails, permanent as a scar, and in town people recognized her by her hands before they recognized her face. She did not mind. The stain was evidence. It said, "I did the work." I touched the fruit. I sorted with my own fingers and packed with my own strength, and the barrels that carry my name were filled by hands that look like this. Within 10 years of Ada's first harvest, 9 families along the creek operated managed cranberry marshes using water rules, sanding methods, and dry harvest sorting techniques that trace back to a flour sack notebook, a Cape Cod scoop, and a girl who had been given 46 acres of acid peat as a punishment. Some of those families succeeded, some failed because they copied the visible parts, the ditches, the gates, the sand, without learning the invisible parts: when to flood, when to drain, how deep to hold, how fast to release, and when to stop and listen to what the water was doing instead of telling it what to do. Ada's real gift was not a method. It was a way of reading land that everyone else had dismissed. Ada Whitlock lived out her years on the edge of the same bog she was supposed to sell for $12 to a man who wanted the water and not the fruit. She never left Whitlock Marsh. In winter, she still walked the ice with a pole, listening for hollow places, long after her children were old enough to do it themselves. She died in the sorting shed, in the chair Jonah had built for her when her knees could no longer take the vine beds, with Mercy's cranberry scoop on the shelf above her head, and the smell of cold fruit and clean wood around her like a room she had always known. Orrin Pike had said it first, standing over a girl kneeling in the mud of a bog everyone called the Sour Sink. "You cannot plant a meal in a swamp." The answer was 46 acres of managed vines, 300 barrels in a strong year, 9 families fed through winters that would have broken them, and a woman's hand opening a sluice gate at dawn while ice cracked and dark water moved, and the vine tips disappeared beneath the flood. Safe. Held. Alive. Ada Whitlock, on her knees in the same cold moss where her mother had once pressed her fingers down, lifting a cranberry runner for a young girl to see. The runner was red at the nodes and green at the tips, and the buds at the end of every upright were next year's fruit, waiting beneath the ice for spring,